And a very warm welcome to the National Union of Journalists virtual town hall event. We're here to discuss the challenges and the opportunities facing the news industry in Wales. My name's Michelle Stanistreet. I'm General Secretary of the NUJ, which is the trade union that's the voice for journalists and journalism across Wales, the rest of the UK, and also the Republic of Ireland. It's great to see that so many people have joined us already tonight and have registered, so hopefully we'll have a few more people arriving shortly. I'm sure the high attendance is not at all related to the dearth of serving pubs and socialising opportunities available to all of us. As we're meeting virtually, one of the benefits of that is that I don't have to bore you with directions to the toilets or where to gather in the event of a fire alarm, but there is one little bit of housekeeping just to flag, which is to highlight the chat facility. So please take a moment to say hi and introduce yourself to everybody. But if you do want to pose a question, if you can use the Q&A box rather than the chat function, that would be really helpful and that will come across to us. We've already had a lot of questions posed in advance, so rest assured we'll have time to come to those after we've heard from our brilliant panel of speakers, and we'll be closing the meeting no later than 7:30 this evening. I'm really delighted that we're joined by speakers who are really passionate and committed advocates for quality, well-resourced journalism, whether that's as citizens and activists, academics, politicians or practitioners. We're going to hear from Martin Sheen, best known of course as a stage and film actor, but also a brilliant champion of quality local journalism who's been working on solutions for the sector in collaboration with journalists and academics, Cardiff University and the Centre for Community Journalism. We're also happy to welcome Dr. Ifan Morgan-Jones, a lecturer in journalism at Bangor University's Department of Creative Studies and Media. He's formerly deputy of Golwg and the current editor of the news and current affairs website, Nation.Cymru. We're also thrilled to have Louise, Elliott, programme and digital editor at ITV Cymru Wales, with a packed journalistic career that started in the newsroom of the Bangor Chronicle, that spanned regional newspapers across Wales and northwest England, before Louise moved into broadcasting, first at HTV, then as a journalist and presenter at the BBC, and now ITV. And we're equally happy to be joined, of course, by Lee Waters, Deputy Minister for the Economy and Transport, and the Welsh Labour and Cooperative Member for Llanelli. Lee obviously also has a journalistic background as a former Chief Political Correspondent of ITV Wales. So tonight's meeting is timely. It's a really important event. It's been initiated and organised by the NUJ's national organiser for Wales, Pamela Moore, and our lay leadership on the union's Welsh Executive Council. And before we move on to our other speakers, I just wanted to take the time to outline the work that the NUJ is doing as part of our mission to revitalise and reconfigure the industry. And it was back in April when the NUJ published its news recovery plan, which was a very immediate and practical response to the crisis caused by COVID-19 to our industry. And the central premise of that was that the pandemic and lockdown had the capacity to destabilise an already beleaguered news industry, ironically just at the time when impartial, trustworthy and relevant news and information was needed more than ever, when we're in the grip of a global health crisis. And it was in the face of kind of enormous looming challenges, but we could also see the opportunity to stand back and reflect and create a more plural and diverse press and broadcasting ecology that genuinely puts public interest journalism at its heart. And that push has been taken up right across the NUJ, right across our nations and regions, and our Welsh Executive Council is now tailoring that plan. And tonight's part of the engagement to build momentum and support for meaningful intervention and change in Wales. Because even before the crisis and the cuts that have flowed from the lockdown onwards, Welsh newspaper titles were suffering really badly after being effectively hollowed out over many years of neglect and a lack of investment from publishers who frankly show themselves to be far more interested in trousering significant profits, anything up to 30% in some years, instead of taking opportunities to shore up investment in resources and in quality. Inevitably, I think we've lost further titles during the pandemic, including the GEM series in the Vale of Glamorgan and Bridgend County Borough. We've also seen significant redundancies that the NUJ has been dealing with across local newspapers, including through Reach and NewsQuest. And according to the heat map that was produced in a report back in 2018 by Mediatique for the UK government, Wales already had disproportionate areas of so-called news cold spots when compared to the rest of the UK. And we've seen in the States and elsewhere, when research is carried out, a clear link between the existence of those kind of news deserts and blackout areas with low voter turnout and kind of civic engagement. So, you know, without trustworthy, relevant news, we do risk detaching and becoming more disenfranchised from our democratic environment and institutions. The NUJ is a firm believer in the role that public service broadcasting plays in that kind of broader journalistic ecosystem. Yet at the same time, BBC Wales is facing massive budget cuts, £4.5 million in this financial year through to next April. That's going to mean a loss of 60 posts and livelihoods. ITV's advertising income has fallen by 42% earlier through this year, and its capital spend has got to be cut by £30 million. We know that budget cuts are coming of £100 million. We've got the same pattern at S4C, £20 million that has been lost over the last 10 years effectively, and the government funding from the UK worth £7 million per year ends in 2022. That's when the financial responsibility shifts over to the BBC, which is also already badly cash strapped. So I think it's significant, isn't it, that the pandemic has reaffirmed the vital role that journalism plays in our communities. We secured acknowledgement of journalists as key workers at the very early stages of the pandemic. We're part of that spectrum of essential public services that I think this crisis has, you know, brought home, how much our public services mean, how much we rely upon them, how much we should care about them. But it's also highlighted the industry's fragility. It's also reaffirmed its kind of lack of plurality and diversity, its very kind of compromised resources and reach, sometimes its relevance too. If you take, for example, the case of Welsh newspapers running UK government-funded COVID-19 advice, but relevant only to an English audience, you know, a complete own goal, really. So our recovery plan kind of identifies and outlines the problems and the challenges as we see them as a union, but most importantly, it offers practical solutions with a range of short and medium term measures that we would like to see put in place. Central to that is an acknowledgement of journalism as a public good, where plurality is vital, where the independent media, all your cooperatives, the hyperlocals, startups, are all as important as the longest standing players in the industry. And an overarching plank of our plan is the need for action to ensure that the tech giants finally pay their way. So we're calling for a windfall tax of 6% and then a levy based on profits imposed as part of a digital services tax mechanism that could then go on to fund public interest journalism. And I think after years of making money from content that they haven't contributed to the creation of, and their role in the advertising crisis that also exists, I think it's high time that there was change. And of course, unlike most other sectors in our economy at the moment, the tech giants have enjoyed a very good crisis with profits and revenues markedly up. So it seems a bit of a no-brainer to me that they should finally start paying their fair share, and that Wales in turn should get its fair share of such funding. I think with the political will, which also kind of does require a kind of global political will for global companies like that, but it could release the means to fund significant and necessary interventions in the news industry. And I should be very clear and upfront that, you know, our position is not about maintaining the status quo. It's not about using public money to prop up failed business models that have kind of led us to this point. Instead, we are very clear that this is an opportunity to use public intervention to reconfigure the industry into one that meets the needs of the public, the needs of our communities. So some of our asks include a Welsh Journalism Foundation with arm's length investment in local news and innovative journalistic projects. We want to see grant funding for startups and new models. We want a long-standing campaign aim of the NUJ has been to call for newspapers to be able to be conferred with asset of community value status, just like exists for community pubs, ensuring that titles could be preserved and sustained in local communities. And that could be coupled with financial and business support for social enterprises and local journalistic cooperatives who are taking over titles that the big players want to relinquish and move on from. I think this year's really brought home how important media literacy is, and an important part of a broader strategy to tackle online disinformation, fake news, conspiracy theories. Would also be providing young people with free news subscriptions to Welsh-based news outlets. And with elections on the horizon, it's also critical that 16 to 18-year-olds do have access to trusted news sources so they can in turn fulfil their democratic duty. It includes a package of tax credits. We want there to be tax credits for jobs for journalists aimed at frontline news gathering roles, for local advertisers, for people taking out print or online news subscriptions. And critically, that's got to be available to all parts of the industry, including hyperlocals and digital-only outlets who were excluded from some of the government-funded help that was disseminated earlier on in the pandemic. And we want better conditions. We're a trade union. We want better conditions for the practitioners who make our industry where it is, with reform of the rights for freelancers who've been so woefully served during this pandemic, many of whom continue to be excluded from the government support schemes that were set up to help staff members of the coronavirus job retention scheme, and also the self-employed income support scheme. So many of our freelance and self-employed members have been totally excluded, cast adrift, and have suffered badly, as have their families and livelihoods as a consequence. So we've just recently launched in the last few weeks the NUJ's Freelance Charter, which is our vehicle to push for the package of reforms for the self-employed that we think are badly needed. The whole package, I think, is eminently achievable. I think its beauty is in its practicality and simplicity. I think the package offers a genuinely exciting blueprint for an industry that is incredibly important to the public good, but is undoubtedly ailing at the moment. If anyone who's attending tonight hasn't yet read the plan, check it out. It's on the NUJ's website, and I'm sure there's a link that's been put up in the chat function too. But like me, I'm sure you're now very keen to hear from our speakers. First up this evening, I'm really pleased to welcome to our virtual town hall meeting, Michael Sheen.
Thanks, Michelle. In a nice bit of synchronicity, the first time I ever saw my name in print was in our local weekly newspaper in Port Talbot, the Port Talbot Guardian, when I was growing up. And I scored a goal for Baglan Boys Club when I was 8 years old. And everyone who scored a goal for any age group football club within the Port Talbot area got their name in the newspaper on a Thursday. And I remember being so excited to see my name. And there it was, for the first time ever in print, Martin Sheen. So they got it wrong as well. So you're not on your own, Michelle.
Oh my God, I'm so sorry.
Don't worry, it's absolutely fine, because it allows me to talk about the Public Guardian, and that's what I meant. It was a nice bit of synchronicity.
What an idiot! Huge.
When I was, don't worry, when I was growing up in Port Talbot in the 70s, there were 5 local newspapers. There were over 20 reporters based there. There's been a 90% reduction in dedicated reporters in Port Talbot. And the numbers of embedded reporters have gone from 11 to 1 now, part-time, based 10 miles away in Swansea. And that's the route that I have taken, I suppose. The Port Talbot Guardian went down, and other news providers came up after that, most notably the Port Talbot Magnet, that was led by Rachel Howells. From 2010 to 2016. But, there's been a massive transformation, and I have noticed it myself because of, being from Port Talbot. And that was what kind of led me into my interest in this area, I suppose, apart from, occasionally getting my name in the newspapers as well. But to see what was happening in my own hometown community. And through talking to Ray about her experience, not just on the Magnet, but Talbot, the news environment in Talbot generally, it led me to see that there are three things that have to be in existence for a community, any community of any size, to have a healthy democratic ecosphere. Then they have to be able, there has to be accurate and trustworthy information and news about what's going on in that community. The community has to feel that its voice is represented, and the community has to feel that those in positions of power and authority within that community and over that community are scrutinized and are held to account. And if those three things don't exist, then you have a very, very dangerous, unhealthy situation. And local news, local journalism can and does provide those three things. And it made me realize how very important that was. And also through the work that Ray has done in researching this, it became clear that a key point wasn't when newspapers closed down necessarily, but a key point in Ray's research was the moment where the news that was being reported about that community was being done by reporters who weren't embedded within that community, that it was being done from people outside. So you have other things like news more and more relying on press releases from councils and local government and that kind of stuff, as opposed to actually being able to have the capacity to be there at the meetings and that kind of stuff. You have more and more the voices that you hear in the local news being high status voices, people within authority and power, as opposed to people within the community being heard and having their point of view put forward. And like I say, a key thing being that the people who are reporting on the news are actually embedded within the community, have an intimate knowledge and relationship with that community. So that's what really struck me, looking at what was going on in our area and from the work that Ray had been doing. But you know, there's no, I'm going to assume that everybody here knows what the problems are. We don't need to talk about that so much. We want to talk about solutions and that kind of thing. So what it led me to starting to see was the importance of a network of people reporting on the news who have intimate knowledge of the communities that they're reporting on, and how wonderful it would be to have a network of small news service providers embedded in their communities, reporting on those communities and accountable to those communities. And of course, that does exist. The hyperlocals that are out there, amazing hyperlocals like, you know, Caerphilly Observer, Wrexham.com, Deeside.com, Cumbraen Life, you know, all these amazing ones that are out there. They're doing amazing work, but the difficulty is, you know, it's not properly paid. They're not getting the kind of support that they need. And so I see personally, I see a real hopeful possibility in what can be done to really support those hyperlocals, those news providers that are out there that are absolutely ingrained within their community, have an intimate knowledge of that community and are able to serve that community. How do you find ways to monetize what they have that nobody else has, which is the knowledge of their community? When their work is able to be just stolen by people and published with absolutely no recourse, then that can't happen. You know, you have to find a way to monetize, I think, that specialist knowledge and that thing that they can give that nobody else can, that's unique. How do you defend them from their work being used against their wishes? And how do you find alternative streams of revenue? Now, obviously, we've seen the collapse of the traditional advertising models for local journalism. And at a time when the sort of the bigger publishers, and this was already happening before the pandemic, but obviously it's been exacerbated by the pandemic, the bigger publishers centralizing more, you know, redundancies, laying people off, streamlining, moving, in the case of, you know, one big publisher, moving the managerial oversight for Wales from Wales to Birmingham. At a time when that is happening, then I think it makes it all the more valuable to have a real direct connection with the communities themselves. So I'm working and doing research and trying to find ways to develop work that's already being done out there to create a more level playing field for the smaller news providers, the local community news providers, to find a way to monetize their specialist knowledge, their unique knowledge, and to find a way where their work can be protected and defended, and also where they can pitch for local news reporting jobs for the other publishers. Because for me, I think that's the hopeful potential for what can come out of this crisis that we're going through, and it is a crisis, but there is an opportunity as well to build something up from the grassroots, to not necessarily try and reinvent the wheel, but to support what's already out there, which I often find is the most, is the best solution anyway. In any case, whether it's journalism or anything else, there is already amazing things being done out there, people doing incredible work. It just has to be supported better, identified, supported better, and celebrated and expanded if possible, developed if possible. And so I think the work that is out there at the grassroots level, there is an opportunity now, I hope, to be able to support that work, connect it up in a more powerful way, so that together they are stronger, in that phrase that we've all come to know and love, with an organization like the Independent Community News Network, representing the voices of all those organizations, giving them a sense of solidarity, and finding a way to make sure that they are stronger, as a group, and that they can make money. That's what, and then there is also the possibility, of course, of that leading to potentially another Pan Wales entity, if that is being fed by the actual grassroots community news service providers. So those are the things that I am very hopeful about, as well as being very hopeful because of looking at organizations like Nation.Cymru, and we're going to hear from Ifan, Voice Wales, the sort of investigative work that Voice Wales are doing as well. There are fantastic things happening out there now, and we need to build on that. I think protect that, build on it, and find ways to work together to be able to use at its heart that local knowledge, that local community knowledge. That would be my vision for what's ahead, I hope. So I'll leave it there for now. Thank you.
Thanks, Michael, and apologies again. I think you're absolutely the key issue that you're raising there is that there are so many brilliant operators out there already. There's so much good stuff happening. How do we support and, as you say, monetize the kind of work that is already taking place? That would be, an amazing step in the right direction. And I think that whole issue of journalism becoming almost ever less local as some of the bigger players move out of some areas, leaving communities with no kind of local news at all, it is a real problem and a challenge for the industry. I wanted next to move and welcome Ifan. So Ifan Morgan-Jones is joining us now. So over to you, Ifan.
Thank you very much. I am on rural Welsh broadband here, so if I break up on occasion, I very much apologise for that. What I want to say, to a large extent, support what has been said already, and I think that is an issue with many of these panels when I've given evidence at the Senedd, especially, is that to a large extent, I think people agree on what the problems are and what the solutions are, and the challenge really is to actually put it into practice and get it done. And that's what I've tried to do with Nation.Cymru to an extent, is to put my my idea. So largely what I'm going to say is I'm going to support what has already been said already by Michelle and Michael. So I think it's helpful to begin with when talking about recovery for the media in Wales, look at where the problems actually are and where they're not. Because one thing I hear very often is that the Welsh media is weak because people just aren't interested in Welsh news and current affairs, that it's essentially somehow boring. So the first thing I'd like to emphasise is that the problem that journalism has in Wales is a supply problem, not a demand problem. Although newspaper sales are declining, you just have to look at the kind of visitor numbers that websites in Wales are getting. I know that Wales Online, for instance, they say they're getting 50 million visitors a month, and even the website I run, Nation.Cymru, which has been largely a one-man band, gets 500,000 visitors a month. And as you know, as someone with a PhD in the history of Welsh journalism, I can quite confidently say that there are more people accessing news about Wales and Welsh current affairs today than I think at any other point in history. So the demand is there, it's the supply that's the problem, a supply of high quality investigative journalism that is in the public interest. Because what we've seen is a big reduction in the number of journalists as we've failed to replace the old advertising-based model and sales-based model with something that works equally well online. So as the number of journalists decrease, what we have is just as many outlets very often, and just as much demand for news, but the ability to deliver that high quality news is greatly limited and greatly diminished. And that leads to a high dependence on more clickbaity news and also a high dependence on PR, and journalists, because of the lack of a time and resources, almost become a kind of sausage machine churning out low quality news. And, you know, that's not a judgment on anyone. I've been in that situation myself as a journalist. And of course, the normal man and woman on the street, as Michael was saying, they don't have a PR department. Their voices aren't heard. It's a very kind of a top-down view of the world that we're getting through our journalism, rather than a kind of bottom-up view of the world. So what I would maintain is that the problem we have here in Wales isn't primarily a lack of outlets. And much of the talk, whenever I mention, you know, the need to improve the media in Wales, much of the talk is very often about revolves around the need to sort of launch a new website or launch a new newspaper, and the way that would expand the plurality. But if you have, you know, two different outlets with a journalist each, and they're both churning out the same press releases because they don't have time to do anything else, you know, that's not plurality. It's a kind of fake plurality. So lack of demand isn't a problem, and the lack of outlets isn't the problem or the primary problem. It all comes down, I think, to lack of journalists and high quality journalism. I think that's the primarily issue we need to solve. I don't think there's any one kind of silver bullet solution to that, but rather there's a variety of things that would help. And a few of those are things we're trying out already with Nation.Cymru. And I think number one is to move away from seeing journalism as a business and a way to make money. It's a public service. It's as essential as a bin collection or running water. You know, it's something that a community needs. And as we've seen over the last few months in a pandemic, reliable news is even more of a life or death situation. And that's because in the absence of that, what you get is misinformation on Facebook. So I don't think it should be seen as, you know, squeezing profit out of as few journalists as possible in order to make money for shareholders. So what we're doing with Nation.Cymru is running it as an independent company without share capital, and every penny we make out of Nation.Cymru just gets plowed back straight into the company itself and funding the journalism and funding the development of the company. And I think that a lot of the newspapers and websites that are cut to the bone at the moment are, you know, actually they would be profitable, but they're part of much larger companies, and perhaps as outlets owned by large companies, they become increasingly unviable. And I think as a means of making large profits, but I think that might actually lead to more opportunities perhaps for people to take them over and fill that gap they've left with not-for-profit ventures. The second thing, and I'm not sure if we can really avoid discussion of this, is some form of public subsidy, you know, especially in communities that are deprived to maintain their own news outlets. You know, some people, whenever I mention some kind of public subsidy, a lot of people, they just recoil at the idea and think, oh, you know, that it's going to be propaganda for the government or whoever funds it. But, you know, we've had it for years with the BBC, and no one blinks an eye with the BBC, and it's well liked and it's well respected around the world. And as I said, you know, journalism is an essential public service, like bin collection, like running water. And if it can be provided commercially, you know, that's fantastic. But if it's not, I think, you know, at some point, some kind of public subsidy needs to step in there. And you know, I've heard mentioned a lot about funding some kind of new service, as we've been doing with the Welsh language, things, you know, some kind of English version of Golwg 360, which I was a deputy editor on. But, you know, I tend to think that in the English language, at least, there's a large amount of news outlets out there already. And what we really need to do, I think, is to fund journalism. And this, I think, is where the BBC's local democracy service has been extremely successful, I think, in funding journalism rather than individual news outlets. So the journalism is done and you get that scrutiny, but then that journalism is available to any outlet that then signs up to it. So what I'd like to see essentially from any kind of publicly funded model is, rather than that money going to outlets, it actually goes to journalists, you know, sitting in court, sitting in hospital health board meetings, and sitting in the Senedd and Senedd committees as well, because I think there's an awful lot of emphasis on the local, but actually, you know, our Welsh Parliament and government has a huge and increasing amount of power over our lives, and that needs the same amount of coverage and scrutiny, which has, you know, certainly so far been absent. If you look at, you know, surveys and opinion polls have been done showing that only about half of people, for instance, know that education is devolved, and only half know that the police is not devolved, and so forth. So we need to inform people about what's going on at the Senedd and in the government as well. The only proviso I would put is that any outlet, I think, that makes use of this publicly funded content should be independent and not part of a larger company with shares, because unfortunately what we've seen to a certain extent with the local democracy service is it being used by for-profit companies as a way of sort of cutting jobs further, because they've got that other sort of stream of news coming in as well. And I think that, you know, if we can do this, there's no reason why we can't aim not just for improving the media in Wales. And in fact, I think the failure of the for-profit model means that we can actually aim for something superior to what we have elsewhere, which is a media funded by the people of Wales, for the people of Wales, and run entirely in the interests of the people of Wales as well. So thank you very much.
That's great. Thanks very much, Ifan. I think it's great to hear you scotch the notion as well that people aren't interested in local news, you know, that there is still a big demand for relevant local information and news. It's a supply problem. And your points about there being practical ways in which public funding can operate in a way that's arm's length and that actually ensures that there's no editorial interference, I think is also a good point and should allay some people's concerns about that. I'm very pleased now to move and welcome Louise Elliott to speak next.
Thank you so much, Michelle. It's lovely to be here with you all. Thanks so much for inviting me to take part this evening. And like you, Michelle, I've actually been quite heartened to hear Ifan talk about the demand that's still very much there. And Michael talking about that local expertise that's, that we need to nurture and cherish. Two things that do give me great heart. I'll just say from the start, I haven't researched or studied any of this. I left school at 16 and barely scraped my O-levels. So my experience is just kind of lived and worked experience of how I've seen changes and what I feel passionately about. So I'm 4 weeks into my new job as programme and digital editor at ITV Cymru Wales. This is something of a baptism of fire, but like I said, I'm really happy to be here with you all. But I have worked as a journalist in Wales for more than 30 years. Like you said, I began at the Bangor Chronicle. I worked in newspapers for 10 years before moving into broadcasting. And in that time, there have been so many changes to our trade. And the huge challenges experienced by our colleagues in newspapers has probably, for me, been one of the most painful to sort of watch and observe and to try to support, my friends and colleagues through it. But the resilience of journalists and, as Ivan's just described as well, the appetite of our audiences, they do continue to support us. And I think that point tonight is probably worth making, because on the programme that I work on, more people are watching Wales at 6 than were watching it 10 years ago. year on year, if we take the month of September, for example, 50% more people were watching Wales at 6 this September than they were in 2019. Online, our coverage is reaching huge audiences, 31 million views on video views on Facebook, 20 million page views on the ITV Wales website. And just for context, that compares to around 9 million for the whole of 2019. And I share this information really just to kind of big up the excellent work that's going on, not just at my organisation. We're all doing it. We're all being so innovative. The insight and the perspective that we're all working so hard to provide in whichever area of journalism we're working, I feel is being consumed and really appreciated by our audiences. And although I've just, measured it all in numbers really, which is, it's kind of how the masters operate, isn't it? We all work in numbers. And as an editor in a commercial public sector broadcaster, I'm very well aware of how important the numbers are. You mentioned right at the start, Michelle, about advertising revenue at ITV down 40% in April this year. I mean, that doesn't come without a huge impact on the business. But it's the impact of our journalism, I feel this year in particular, almost more than any time in my 30 years. It's previously been hard to qualify, but I think this year we can quantify the value of what we do. I just feel that's been demonstrated by the pandemic, and it's revealed to us as journalists that in the face of our national emergency, I believe that our audiences have relied more than ever on our channels to communicate those key coronavirus public service messages, to mass audiences. And of course, within that, quite properly scrutinise and hold government to account and scrutinise government performance as well. And that thing that Michael was talking about right at the start, about that, that hyper local, I think the pandemic has revealed to us as well just how important, as a national broadcaster, just how important that hyper local feel to what we do it is. I really think it's crucial. I mean, Ofcom's research this week has been talking about how the importance of that geographically sort of specific information on COVID-19, accurate, personally relevant information, and that's been kind of proved to be really, really essential. And I think our online coverage and our, what journalists can do in the digital space has been a huge part of delivering that to new audiences. We know that online is can be a place for rumor, gossip, paranoia, whatever. This year, the value of having trained journalists making that impartial news, broad range of opinions, broad range of ideas, impartially presented, I think has been more important than ever. And, alternative facts or whatever it is you want to call them, peddling all of that online is very cheap. Verifying, reporting facts is very expensive. But I think, I think we've all stepped up to the mark as journalists in Wales, and I personally feel very proud of what I've achieved with my newsroom, but also what we're all achieving. There has been a gold standard, I think, of trust and reliability in Wales. And while we do face really, really difficult challenges, I think that we do need to remind ourselves about the great work that we do. I'm editor of television and online services. The ambition is equal for both of those in my newsroom. And I just think that digital space, when we're talking about new audiences and, new journalists and who they are and where they come from, the digital space for me is where, we can make a really big difference and where we can reach those new audiences. For me, TV is kind of the black cab to digital's Uber. The service is the same. You want to get from A to B, you need to make a journey, but instead of standing on the road and, you know, holding your hand out, you organize it, you know, you press an app on your phone. You want the same service. You want to get in a car to take you somewhere, but the delivery of that service is different. So in any conceivable future, whatever solutions that we do eventually come up with, and we'll, you know, debate them tonight, I think what we do now, even in our more traditional ways, even in on a traditional 6 o'clock news program on television, you know, the debates we have, the issues we raise, the voices that we champion, they're all relevant in any conceivable future that we can see. However we're delivering that trusted impartial journalism, the value that we bring and what we do is still going to be really, really important. But I think for me, finding those journalists, how we nurture that next generation of talent, that's one of my biggest passions. Like I said, I left school at 16, never had a university education, and I've become very well used in my 30 years as a reporter to really not feeling like the smartest person in the room. But what I find really difficult is the change over the years in how people like me and others who it's just finding that route in to our industry. And Michael, you was touching on this, you know, a little bit earlier with what you were saying, with just that, how important that local knowledge is, and how we kind of may have tilted the balance too far in undervaluing that. And it's just about tilting that balance back and valuing that. And I just think local newspaper newsrooms, you know, however they evolve, they were the thing that from which I benefit. And elsewhere, we've got the gold standard journalism courses in Wales, organisations. Oh, it's telling me my internet's unstable. I'm going to keep going until, shall I keep going? Yeah. I think it's still there. Those kind of, those courses that
you might want to just try, Louise, just switching off your video for the next minute.
Shall I keep talking while my videos?
We can hear you now. Yeah, that's fine.
Sorry, that's my dodgy broadband right in the centre of Cardiff. So I was just saying about those journalism courses where lots of talent comes through, but you know, I feel that we need to work much harder to find that talent from untapped communities which are currently untapped. And I think this feeds into what Ifan and what Michael was saying earlier. You know, we've given a lot of thought at ITV Cymru Wales recently about taking action to accelerate our diversity and our inclusion strategy. You know, we've had conversations, haven't always been comfortable, but we're coming to a place and putting great effort into seeing some results. And the training that we're offering, you know, we're looking into, we've taken on 2 digital journalists as apprentices from, you know, non-traditional backgrounds. We've got some digital journalists now working in the Welsh language in our Welsh language teams for S4C, again, non-traditional routes. And I'm just really heartened by that because, you know, I'm starting to see people coming from communities and places that, you know, that could have been in school with me. And I think that's really, really important in the mix of everything else. I'll just finish up, I suppose, by just saying a bit about public service broadcasting, because of course we can't even assume that there's a future for it, can we, at the moment? But let's be optimistic and say that there will be a positive route forward. But I think, you know, radical change is needed. Ofcom, the regulator, this week acknowledged exactly that, really. Laws, regulations must be overhauled, and they're looking at radical change. We aren't out of the woods yet in all of this debate, lots of work to be done. And like we all appreciate, there's a hell of a lot at stake. But I think, you know, as far as broadcasting is concerned, I think, you know, in plurality, a Welsh media landscape without a commercial public sector broadcaster like ITV, I mean, for me, it just doesn't look right. So making those radical changes and working together to achieve that, you know, hopefully gets us to the place that we need to be, with the people, crucially, and the journalists that we need to find to make our organisations thrive.
Thanks so much, Louise. I think you're really right to point to the kind of pride that you feel in what's been achieved with your team and other colleagues, because I know the pandemic, it's properly tested kind of many journalists who've really worked so hard through this year. Their resilience has really been thoroughly tested too, but it has demonstrated how valuable their work and how valued the work of journalism is through this period. And I know that so many different outlets have seen spikes in audience figures and reach and readership, and that's because it's genuinely made a big difference, you know, to many people. Having their kind of local broadcaster, local newspapers has been a lifeline for many people. We are going to return to the points that you've made, important ones about diversity and about opening up better and newer and different access into our trade when we come to the questions. So we will return to that. But last but not least, I'm very pleased to welcome Lee. So Lee, we'll move to you next, and then to people's questions.
Thanks very much, and I'm very pleased to be on such a impressive panel. All have been journalists, and Michael has brilliantly played one. But I thought I'd like to defy the stereotype of being the windbag by politician by being the one that didn't go on. So I'll try and keep mine short so we can get into the discussion. I just try to draw a couple of themes out, because I think there's some really interesting points made by everybody, really, and this of the central dilemma between Michael's point of finding a way of commercializing and monetizing it, and Ifan's point that this should be primarily a public service. And I guess I would say, you know, journalism has always been about disruption and change, and the business model has always been precarious and shifting. And you know, it is a case study for what digital disruption looks like. You know, for the last 30, 40 years, digital has been turning journalism, certainly the commercial side of journalism, on its head, and we're really seeing the fruits of that now. And I guess that's going to be true for lots of industries as automation does its thing. You know, I don't think, you know, people are not less interested. Ifan was making the point about this a supply problem, not a demand problem. And I'm just not sure about that, because, you know, it's certainly true that, you know, people are always interested in local news. What they're not interested in paying for it. And there's enough information out there to quench their thirst for something, but it's just not curated, not craft, it's not professional. And I think that's where the danger slips in. And I think that's really what this discussion needs to be about, is finding a way towards a business model. You know, Louise was saying with public service broadcasting being under threat, and it is, and it always has been. You know, when I started working in ITV 19 years ago, frighteningly enough, the first meeting I went to was about cutbacks and how public service broadcasting was on its arse and how ITV's days were numbered. And look, you know, 2 decades on, it's still there and it's thriving. And Louise is right, the quality of the journalism through the pandemic from ITV has been excellent, notwithstanding one duffing up I had from Andrew Byrne the other night, which wasn't very good. But I think Rob Osborne's reports have been first class, you know, just really superb. And I think the stuff Ifan's been doing on Nation.Cymru has been really important and valuable as well. Coming from a different standpoint, obviously, with a touch of polemicism thrown in there. But you know, that's good. That's plurality, isn't it? And I think so. There's lots of positive things there. But as Alan Evans was saying in the chat, who runs Llanelli Online, you know, trying to make that work for at a hyper local level. There's been a debate in the shadow what hyper local is, but a local level is the devil's own job. 5 years ago, when I got involved in Llanelli politics, there were 2 weekly newspapers. Now there isn't one really. You know, there's still a masthead, but the Llanelli Star, it doesn't sell much. Doesn't really, it's not grounded in a way. And Alan is there in you know, a valiant but difficult battle to try and make it work. Because people still value, advertisers still value a piece of paper they can see their adverts in, and they don't value, and they're not willing to pay to put adverts online in the same way. So there's a profound and fundamental economic challenge, I think, to make what we all agree is important viable. And if it's not just the crusade of a hobbyist. Because the trouble with the hobbyists, some of them are fantastic. Look at Wrexham.com. I think, if you're watching the Welsh Government press conferences, Wrexham.com consistently ask the sharpest questions, consistently. And I don't know the people there at all. I might just be very impressed by their work. But I don't know what their business model is like. But I'm assuming, they're not doing it for the money. And Michael is right. We do need to find a business model that allows people to make a living from doing this, and not just people who do because they're passionate about it. Because there are other examples, and the one in Penarth, I can't remember the name of it now. I know it more by its reputation. Certainly has a reputation for angry man with a keyboard carrying out personal vendettas. So there's a danger to hyperlocal as well, and I think craftism is important. So how do we find a business model? And I think the NUJ manifesto is important. I think we should come back to that and discuss some of the ideas in there. Some of them are a bit flaky, but you'd expect that. Some, come on, journalists got to take it as well as give it, Michelle. But let's test that. Some of them are tax stuff which Welsh Government can't control. But there's some really valuable stuff in there as well. And I think the idea of a government-funded journalism foundation is a really important one. I think we should think some more about. And I think there is a role for government and public funding, but as a co-funder. Journalism do not want to be the recipient simply of core government money. And there are models now through the Welsh Books Council where Go Look 360 gets money. I used to run the Institute for Welsh Affairs and the magazine there, Agenda, and the website that was going for a long time, Click on Wales, was a recipient of Welsh Books funding money. So there's precedent there for that. When I was on the Assembly's Culture Committee, we made recommendations for a wire service for Wales, a bit like a PA feed that's stripped away. And now in government, I'm, as well as having portfolio responsibilities, I'm responsible for strategic communications across the government. Sounds grand, it's not really. But one of the things we're looking at is, can we look at that Go Look 360 model to fund a Senedd-based newswire service that could potentially be distributed through the BBC Local Democracy Service Network or some other ones that can provide some scrutiny and some coverage of the government and the Parliament. So we're working through the practicalities of that and how affordable it is, because there's no money around, never is, but it's going to be, we're in a particularly bleak period because there are tons of stories. As Louise mentioned, when I was on the committee, partly to make a point that there were stories and journalists just weren't covering them, even the ones the lazy buggers based there. I would tweet of things I've learned in the committee today, and there was 9 or 10 things in most committee meetings which were stories, but they just weren't noticed or picked up. So there's definitely, the material is there. There's the demand for it is, the need for it is there. It's the economic model, I think, is what's really lacking. So some kind of foundation where we make an ask of the charitable trusts and foundations who never give Wales a population share, let alone more. Maybe a government contribution to that as well, and then finding a revenue stream which is sustainable. I think that's where our focus needs to be. We all know the problem. We can all talk about the problem. The hard bit is the solution. And I think the NUJ's contribution is a really important one to really take that debate on. Yeah.
Thanks very much, Lee. You've kind of livened up the chat. I see you've upset people by referring to colleagues at Wrexham.com as hobbyists. I think it's interesting as well.
Okay, I didn't mean that as a pejorative. As I said, I didn't know their business model. I started off with a compliment, how impressed I was by them.
Well, Emma's come in to make clear that they are, they're 2 full-time journalists who work very hard to kind of serve that community in Wrexham. You didn't mention the elements of the NUJ's plan that you think are flaky. I'd be very keen to hear more. The other element of kind of ways of freeing up money, because the money could be there, that you didn't pick up on, is the role of the tech giants. And I'd just be interested to hear, where you think their responsibilities lie, because it's quite clear that with a package of different measures, public money from the tech giants could free up a significant resource that would go a massive way to funding a sector that I think we're all agreeing is a public good and provides a vital service in our communities. It's not just another business, another industry that we can kind of allow to wither or die. But just be keen, before we move to the questions, what your thoughts are about the role that the tech giants can play here and their contribution.
Sorry, my daughter's interrupting me for a piano lesson. Excuse
Hello.
me. Yeah, well, I agree with you. Clearly, I'm just focusing on what I can influence, and the Welsh government can't really influence the tech giants. That's why I was, it's easy to talk about stuff that you don't have to follow through on. I think you absolutely make a strong argument for that. I think the appetite for the UK government going after the tech giants is pretty small, and I think that the tech giants. That are doing some stuff of their own bat, because they recognise the sense in it to support journalism too. So I don't think we should immediately see tech giants as the enemy. They're certainly a monopoly player, and that needs to be challenged. But I think there's a way of working with the tech giants too, potentially.
And obviously a lot of that engagement is going on, isn't it? It's interesting, I mean, because we've been doing as a union a lot of work engaging and talking to lots of different stakeholders through this year. And I think not just in the UK, those conversations, but actually globally, the conversations our sister unions are having with politicians and policymakers elsewhere. I think there is a changing understanding, or I think there was a real resistance earlier this year to kind of any movement of compelling funding from the tech giants, and I think that's transitioning. I think that's changing. I think there's a greater political will there to take some action.
Can I just ask, Michelle, because I totally get that Lee said that there's a limit to what Welsh government can do around the big tech giants, but what about around government advertising spend and access to statutory public notices for hyperlocals and that kind of thing, which would make, I think, a significant difference to a lot of people. That's something you can do something about it.
Yeah, so I think that's really interesting. That's a good point, and I think that's where I think there is a role for Welsh government. I think statutory public notices are terrible, and I think there's a problem is that the lobbyists seized on we want statutory public notices. What are they for? And I think we're confusing ends with means here. And what we're really saying is we think the government should use its hard and soft power to support the sector. Agree. I think going after statutory public notices whose days are numbered is probably not the best way to do that. So to give an example, I'm taking through a reform of 20-mile-an-hour zones. So for 2023, we're not going to have 20-mile-an-hour zones. We're going to have a national speed limit, which is 20. And then local areas can pitch to have their stretch of road 30 rather than the other way around. So at the moment, every time you put a 20-mile-an-hour zone in, you have to do a statutory notice. So there's a revenue stream from that. Now, I think we should get rid of that. We should do it digitally. Government should consult with communities in a very different way. But that takes away that chunk of money which currently goes to newspapers and makes their economic situation worse. So we know that's coming in 2023. We've got a couple of years to think about what replaces that as a revenue stream and what we might ask in return for that. Because at the moment it's free money. Nobody reads the statutory notices in the local newspapers. It's a bargain we strike. So I think in the spirit of something for something, government should continue to spend a similar amount of money supporting local journalism, but government should ask something in return for it. What should it ask? Discuss.
I think that is being picked up in the chat, and the significant kind of income stream that the statutory notices provide for the current kind of industry players is being referenced. Emma Meese makes a good point about there not being that level playing field between the traditional players and hyperlocals and different smaller news publishers across Wales and the UK. I'm just noting the time is now 7, so we're going to move into some of the questions that have already been posed, and we're also being sent a number of additional questions that have been kind of posed in the chat box and the Q&A box as well. I'm going to just come to them in kind of batches. So there's 3 questions that have been asked that kind of relate to the democratic importance of journalism, local journalism, especially in a health crisis that we've experienced this year. And then I'm going to come to each panel member in turn for you to pick up on any element of those. The first is pointing out that with the elections coming next year and in 2022, and the fact that 16 to 18-year-olds are going to be able to vote, the question is that young people tend not to get their news from newspapers or traditional broadcast media. So how does the panel think that young people should be engaged? Second question, academic research has found that as local newspapers close, voter turnout decreases. How does the panel think that the situation in Wales needs to be tackled? And finally, more people in Wales have become indie curious during the COVID-19 pandemic. Does the panel think that the lack of media outlets across Wales reporting on local issues and able to carry specifically Welsh messages about the pandemic is adding to a democratic deficit in the country? I'm going to come first to you, Lee, and then Michael, Louise, and Ifan.
Sorry, I wasn't fully paying attention, to be honest. Truth, I thought you'd come to me last. I was looking
Do you
at
want me to come
the chat.
Yes,
please. Thank you very much. Save my blushes. I've got myself into enough trouble as it is.
No worries. Michael, let's come to you.
Okay. What was the last one you said about? Oh, about the democratic...
people becoming indie curious, and it just is the lack of media outlets across the country reporting on local issues, carrying Welsh messages. Is that adding to the democratic deficit?
The thing that made me immediately think about, I'm not entirely sure why, but the idea that during the Industrial Revolution, all our infrastructure was set up to get stuff out of Wales. It wasn't for our own benefit. It wasn't to keep our raw materials here. And I look at myself as being part of the legacy of that, in that if I was a Welsh raw material, my pathway was out of Wales as well. And it's terrible if our news itself also heads out of Wales and just drops into the sea. We have to find ways to connect up our nation, whether it's through some sort of, a network of local entities, or whether it's through a national platform, well supported and all that kind of stuff. We have to be able to make sure that democratic deficit that you're talking about, it is such a danger. It was already happening, obviously, before the pandemic, but the idea of our infrastructure crumbling, our media structure crumbling, our ability to connect and share, have platforms where we can gather together, whether it's physically or digitally, is so important to be able to share our stories. And that isn't just about news. That's also about us telling our stories, both through drama and however it might be. That we have to find a way to say who we are, say who we can be, share that with ourselves as well as projecting it out to the world. And so that's a bit of a tangent from what you were talking about, but it was the thing that occurred to me. The other point about engaging with younger voters now from 16 to 18 before the election next year, I think, yeah, absolutely, that is the challenge. Everyone talks about how do you engage with 16 to 18-year-olds, no matter whether it's journalism or anything else. But I do like the idea of, or certainly to start the debate around an idea like the one that's put forward in the NUJ plan of something along the lines of a voucher scheme for people to subscribe to news services, Wales-based news services. I mean, I'm very grateful to Nation.Cymru for letting me know that I don't have to be in quarantine after tomorrow, which was fantastic news that I found today on your site. So thank you very much for that. The engagement, if it's vibrant and if the news is meaningful and is about what matters to you, then people will go, as long as they know about it, as long as it's signposted and you have access to it. If it speaks to you, I see no reason whether you're an 80-year-old in Llanelli or a 16-year-old in the Sandfields estate in Patelba. If you have access, you know about it, you have access to it, and it matters to you, and it reflects you and your life and the things that matter to you, the appetite is there. So people have just got to be a bit more innovative about. Well, there's a few different things there, isn't there? Access, signposting, and relevance, I suppose. But that's how you engage with people, I think, isn't it?
Great, thanks, Michael. Louise, have you got anything to add to any of those points?
Yeah, I'm just interested to hear Michael talk about the engagement of 16 and 17-year-olds, because For me, the information is all the same, and that's kind of the point I made earlier, that what we do is the same in any conceivable area. For me, it's the storytellers. It's how we cast the storytellers for young people. And I think that younger people want to have news that's made for them by people like them, people that live in their communities, people that sound like them, people who communicate text like them, whatever it is they do. You know, it's not being told the news by people like me. That's what I'm getting at. And I just think we need I think it's a real priority for news organisations across Wales to find those new generation of storytellers who are going to create content for people like them, and they're going to be able to engage them well. It needs to be authentic storytelling. You know, it needs to be communicated, like I said, in the language that younger people want to consume their news, not the kind of language that I use. And in that, you know, at ITV, like I mentioned earlier, we do have digital journalist apprentices who are coming through the ranks. You know, we've got specifically digital journalists for our Welsh language output. These are new roles. These roles didn't exist 12 months ago. But these are things that I think are important in reaching those audiences and you know, helping to engage younger people in those, you know, those areas of democracy that will be so important in May.
Absolutely. Good to hear about those digital apprentices. Ifan, let's move to you.
I'd just like to make one point about the democratic deficit. And I think this is a massive problem on a national level in Wales, where the amount of the lack of basic understanding of Welsh politics and even what powers the Senedd has is very surprising, because I spoke earlier about surveys showing that only 50% know what's devolved. But actually, I was part of the Senedd task force on digital news, and they found that essentially only about 5% was really interested in what went on in the Senedd and were very well informed about it. And I think there's a real danger here, I think, not just to journalism, but to the kind of idea of Wales as a separate political entity. Because I think that, honestly, there's it's not as much as a problem now that there's this amount of sort of lack of knowledge out there about the Senedd. But if there was a concerted political campaign, I think, to get rid of the Welsh Government and the Senedd, I think there would be a very big vacuum there that could be filled with a lot of disinformation, as we saw during the EU referendum. And Lee was talking about, you know, what does the Welsh Government get out of funding journalism? Well, one thing it might get out of funding journalism in Wales is survival, really, because there's such a lack of information there about what the Welsh Government does at the most basic level. People could be very easily misled, I think, if there was a concerted campaign to abolish devolution, as we've seen with the internal market bill at Westminster, where you know, the Senate's power has been rolled back to a certain extent by Westminster, and it's been done under people's noses. Because if you ask people, you know, do you think these powers should be taken away from Wales? I think most people would say no, and you know, they voted in a referendum for those powers, but they're just not aware that it's happening. You know, people just don't know about these they don't pay attention to this kind of thing, and they're not aware of it. So I think that that democratic deficit is really a danger, not just because we think, you know, it's a good thing if people knew what was going on and it would be a good thing for democracy. But I think it's at a more fundamental level. I really think that over the next 10 years or so, I think Welsh democracy will come under threat, I think. And that kind of, you know, people in Wales do support the existence of a Welsh Government and do support the existence of a Senedd, but they're not really clued up on the details of that. I think if those things are to survive in the long term, I think we need to increase people's knowledge of those as well.
Thanks very much. Lee.
Yeah, so just to clarify Ivan's point there, you know, the Welsh Government does fund journalism, as we've just discussed it. It funds it a number of ways through Golwg 360 and other forms of publications. It also funds it through the notices we've discussed. The point I'm making is there's an opportunity. You know, we shouldn't be dying on the hill of defending statutory notices is my point. I think there are more effective ways of getting that information out. What I'm saying is there's an opportunity to make an argument the money we currently spend on that can be spent in a different way. And just as we know, one of our commitments, for example, as a government is to the fair work agenda. So one of the things we're looking at is how when we procure services, do we say, well, if you're going to be having Welsh Government money for running a contract, we expect from you a set of decent behaviours towards your workers. We expect you maybe to recognise a trade union if one wants to be recognised. We expect a living wage, those sort of things. And that's what I mean. And if we are going to be putting out there, if a case is made for saying we should be replacing this funding and giving it still to journalism, there's a debate to be had about the strings we attach to that. That's the point I was trying to make. It's been a long week and a long day, and I'm not being as crafted with my words tonight as I ought to be, and I should know better with a crowd like this. Of course, democratic deficit is not a new thing either. The debates about Welsh people turning their aerials to the Mendips or getting Granada, that's a 40, 50-year-old debate as well. So these are not new things. I guess what is new is that in the last 20 years, we've had our own tier of government. And over the last 12 months, people who didn't know much about devolution all of a sudden realize there's quite a bit of power. And quite a lot of them don't like it. So Ifan was saying, if there'll be a concerted campaign to get rid of devolution, it's already here, Ifan. 25% of people want to abolish the assembly. And similar number want independence. So these are not new themes. I think the real issue is younger voters, and from May, 16-year-olds will get the vote in Wales for the first time. And this is a deeply disenfranchised and uneducated part of the electorate about basic civic functions. It was forever this. And this is one thing the traditional broadcasters, traditional media are really struggling to engage with. The BBC has published a lot of its research in how the under 24s really are not engaging with its news, and they are looking for and struggling to find ways that can engage them, and that is a real challenge, I think, for all of us, because I suspect what we'll see in May is a very depressed turnout amongst the 16-year-olds, and that I hope will provoke us all to think more about how we engage and how we educate in civic skills and lessons this part of the electorate. And even point about the small number of electorate being engaged in news. And again, that's not new. We know there's been research for years showing that more % of people are really interested in what's going on. So a lot of these are not new themes, I don't think, but technology, as I said at the beginning, is disrupting things far more fiercely than it has, and exposing these divisions in a far more visible way.
So there's lots of contributions in the chat, but I'm going to move through to the next batch of questions because I've got an eye on the time left, and I want to try and get through everybody's. And these kind of relate more to kind of plurality, which all of our panelists have touched on, or the lack of. First one is with the latest round of redundancies and title closures in Wales, plus the expected cuts to BBC Wales, ITV, Cymru, S4C, do the panel think that radical action needs to be taken to ensure that Wales is served by a diverse media? I think you've all touched on different solutions. What business model or funding model should we be trying to allow local journalism to thrive in Wales? And the global tech giants are a serious threat to the general quality and plurality of our journalism. It's a problem that faces everyone worldwide, but in Wales we're also too dependent on the BBC. How should we react to this challenge without jeopardising public broadcasting? Who wants to come in on any of those first? Ifan, can I come to you?
I think the danger of asking a lot of questions at once is that I only remember the last one. So I think the one with the BBC is difficult because BBC is an essential service and we'd be much the poorer without it. But one thing the BBC has done is by providing such a good service online in Wales, they've made it much more difficult for everyone else to move to a kind of business model that might be profitable, because very difficult for anyone else to put a price on their journalism because the BBC is always there and it's always free and it's usually doing a fantastic job. So I think I saw some stats. Reuters produce this digital news report every year, and they had some stats showing that in those countries where there wasn't a kind of a free BBC service, people were much more likely to be willing to pay for their online news, and where kind of everyone was behind the paywall, than in countries where there were sort of free services online. So I know the BBC have taken steps to help with that, with things like the local democracy service, of course, but I think that the BBC needs to think about ways where it can perhaps scale back its online service, but perhaps think of other ways where it can mitigate the effect that its online service is having on the ability of other businesses perhaps to provide kind of bespoke services that would be people would be willing to pay for online.
Louise, can I come to you next?
Yeah, I'll pick up on a different one then to Ifan. The one about the radical action that needs to...
Sorry, Louise, your signal's playing up again.
take...
Maybe if you try and switch off your video again, that might help.
Is it just...
If you maybe just stop your video and see if that makes a difference. Thanks. Can we hear you now?
There we are. Is that any better?
Yes, sorry, Louise, that's better.
I was always better on radio than on television. I'm going to pick up on the one about the radical action and the you know, the redundancies. And I mean, I just want to say that I really do feel the pain and the pressure of other colleagues in other newsrooms around Wales who are experiencing you know, those kinds of cuts. We're not expecting cuts at ITV Wales. We're still advertising and hiring for roles. And I might as well say it while we're all here as journalists. I'm looking for senior content editors, so do get in touch if you want to chat about that. But you know, we can't ever rule out anything changing in the future, can we? But we're kind of just getting on with it and ploughing through, I think, is the best way to describe it. And I just wanted to bring in my new role, one of the joys is reading Ofcom reports. And you know, they're talking about the future of public service broadcasting, and they themselves are now talking about radical action. You know, this is the language that Ofcom is using itself. And the kinds of things that they're talking about is new providers coming into the public service remit, you know, whoever they might be, talks about incentivizing those new providers with things like tax relief. You know, these are quite radical ideas. You know, people being new providers being granted prominence, you know, and then existing public service broadcasters working with new providers, you know, new partnerships and new ways of working. So all of that, you know, to me sounds pretty radical. So I think, you know, change is coming, and ITV is broadly, you know, interested and supportive of a lot of what Ofcom is saying. If there's a fair return for those public service broadcast efforts, I think that's the big thing for ITV as well. But, you know, models of real flexibility in newsrooms, I think are going to become just more and more common, and more, you know, that will be the way that the way that more and more of us are working in the future.
Can I just come in on that? Because I met the chief executive of Ofcom a couple of weeks back, and I must say radical was not the word I left the meeting with. And I was challenging them to do an assessment of the quality and the breadth of the coverage by network and UK broadcasters of Wales during the pandemic. And it was hard work. So I don't think Ofcom are going to ride to our rescue. but I certainly think we should put a lot more pressure on them. You know, they were set up by a Labour government to be a light touch regulator, and it's been a disaster. I think you only have to look at commercial radio to see what they've let happen there. Just a homogenization of the market. I hope Louise is right, but I wasn't left feeling terribly optimistic from that conversation, I got to say. In terms of the question about tech giants being bad for plurality and for quality, well, I certainly think they're a problem for plurality. I'm not sure they're a problem for quality, though. You know, just looking at the last couple of months on Twitter, the Twitter fact checks on Donald Trump have been excellent quality. So I think again, I think there's a danger we can have sweeping statements here which don't quite capture the tapestry of it. And there was one other point I was going to make, and I've forgotten it. Perhaps I can come back.
Well, don't worry, think about it and you can come back. I'm going to move now to a question that's been sent in for Michael, saying that you've done a lot of work, Michael, to raise awareness for some important campaigns in Port Talbot and around South Wales. What would you hope that the next generation of journalists take from that in terms of covering local issues?
Well, I suppose how important it is to use what platform you have, whether you're a journalist, a reporter, a celebrity, or whatever it might be, that you use it to tell stories, no matter how much people might say that no one else will be interested outside of that local area or whatever. I think things resonate with people if you connect with it yourself. If it matters to you, then, and as Louise was talking about, the who delivers that message, the way it's delivered can make a big difference as well, obviously. But if it matters to you, that's the main point, I think. And no matter what that story is, I suppose the difficulty with that question is that for journalists who are coming, they have to have the platform to be able to do that on. There has to be the infrastructure there and the network there to tell those stories and for people to pick up on them, and that's there have been things, and still are stories and issues that I want to explore, and I haven't been able to find the right platform for it or the way to do it. So if I'm finding difficulty with it, and I have a lot of resources, I can only imagine how difficult it is for other people as well. So it has to be done on multiple fronts, doesn't it, really?
Absolutely. Thanks. And there's another one. In fact, there's a very similar question also posed for Lee as well, but to you. Do you think that more should be done to help people from disadvantaged areas break into the media industries? And what do you think should be done?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I absolutely agree with that. And I'm part of a project that is about trying to create support and pathways for people coming from areas where there may be more barriers than for others. This it brings up all kinds of things, doesn't it? The idea of unpaid internships is an absolute scourge, because the more that people are unable to afford themselves to do things that other people can afford, then you're already, if you're being asked to do an unpaid internship, a lot of the people I know just won't be able to afford that. People who come from the community I come from, they just can't do it. So it's already saying, well, if you can afford it, you can have your way into it. I heard a story the other day about people who not only was it unpaid, they were having to pay themselves to be able to go and do it, which is extraordinary. So there are things like that, obviously, that can be done to help, but there have to be pathways created. You can't just expect people to be able to, individually break down the barriers that are there systemically for you. Now, whether that's to do with it's a sort of old-fashioned word now, but the class you come from, or your ethnicity, or whatever it might be, your gender, your sexuality, those obstacles have to be got rid of. And again, it has to be done from multiple points of view, whether it's government, local authority, activism, whatever it might be, funders, philanthropy, but definitely those pathways have to be created. And I am at the moment part of trying to develop a national UK national pilot project to try and do something about that, definitely.
Really important work, absolutely important. Lee, did you want to come in on that?
Yeah, so first of all, hats off to Michael for using his big lamp to shine the light on this. He doesn't need to give a shit about this stuff, and he does, and fair play to him. I think I disagree with him a little bit though on what he just said. So I understand the point about unpaid internships, but I'm a working class kid from Ammanford. I wouldn't have got into journalism had I not done work experience on the South Wales Guardian every summer from the age of 14 to the age of 19, 20, and on the Cambrian News when I was a student in Aberystwyth. So that was unpaid work experience. That wasn't about middle class relationships or daddy knew someone. That was me writing to the editor saying, can I have work experience? So I think we need to just be careful about how we characterize all internship. It's more complex than that. I do think, though, I think we do need to make proactive measures. So I know it's slightly different, but Green Man do a brilliant screen every year with Merthyr College, where they get students from Merthyr College in running the events, doing the TV, doing the lighting. And I think it's that kind of proactive socioeconomic interventions to give people pathways that we should see more of, rather than trying to close off some of the existing ones. I just remember the point from the last round. I just want to make. I'll make it briefly. Just on the BBC bashing. I don't sign up to it myself. I don't think the BBC is too big or is a problem. I think the rest of the ecosystem is, and therefore the BBC seems like a problem. Actually, the BBC is doing a good thing. I think what we should challenge them, and I do challenge them on, is that they should be searching for the gaps and filling the gaps, not trying to do stuff that everybody else does. So I've been very critical of the change on Good Morning Wales, and I'm a former Good Morning Wales producer, so maybe Rodri Telford-Davies always tells me I'm just biased and hankering back for the time when I was there, and maybe he's got a point. But I think the BBC there saw commercial radio moving away and stepped in the gap and tried to replicate commercial radio, and that's not what the BBC is there for. It should be there to do something that commercial radio isn't doing, which is a serious news program that gives politicians a hard time. And nobody does that on morning radio now. It's just not there. Similarly, it's good that the Democracy Service has shown a light on council reporting, but there are other gaps. So, magistrates' courts is the famous one, but there are other gaps that I think we should be forcing the BBC to use its privileged position to fill, rather than trying to emulate what the market does. But I think that we should take a more subtle critique of the BBC rather than just saying they're a problem.
Thanks, Lee. I mean, just to come back on your points about work experience and internships, I mean, they're two very different beasts, aren't they? There's absolutely a role, in the NUJ's view for kind of decent work experience opportunities where somebody can go in, kind of get an experience of what work and life in a newsroom is like, be able to shadow somebody, kind of get that taste of and get under the skin of a particular title or broadcaster. But internships, they're often, advertised for months, 9 months, a year. They're classed as, so-called opportunities. They're not paid. People's expenses aren't paid. That's completely in contravention of the law on the national minimum wage, but it's also a complete exploitation of people's ambitions and aspirations, isn't it? And if, you haven't got the bank of mum and dad or somebody propping you up to be able to do that, then the most ordinary people simply can't take up those opportunities, and that they're not opportunities. That's about organisations exploiting people. And so I think they're the differences between the two. I think what you were describing was your kind of traditional work experience taste, which I agree is a really positive thing.
Yeah, that's a fair point.
I'm really conscious of the time, and I'm afraid we're kind of running out of time, and we're going to have to wind up. There's been loads of really good questions. I'm sorry we haven't been able to get around all of them. Before everybody who's attended tonight goes off, I wanted to set you a task, because I'd be really keen for everybody who's taken part tonight to kind of stay engaged with the campaign that the NUJ's running on our news recovery plan, but also the Fair Deal for Freelancers campaign that I mentioned earlier. It'd be great if you can engage with your local representatives and in your local networks about this need to kind of reboot our news industry and more firmly root it in the public good. I wanted to say a massive thank you to our brilliant panel of speakers. If we had everybody who could be putting up their virtual hands in applause, I'm sure we would have, but thank you very much to Louise, to Lee, to Ifan and to Michael. I wanted to say also a big thanks to the NUJ's Welsh Executive Council and to Pam, Rachel and Francis who've organised tonight and made it happen. But thank you to everyone else who's come along and taken part. I hope you can head off now and enjoy the rest of your evening. Thank you very much. Bye, everybody.